The courtroom door swung open, and the echo of high heels clicked against the marble floor. A young woman strutted inside, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, a designer purse hanging from her wrist. She smirked as she glanced around, barely acknowledging the officers standing by the walls. "Miss Valerie Hunt," the bailiff announced. She didn't flinch. If anything, she looked amused, almost bored. She had seen courtrooms before, her father had dragged her to a few, though never as a defendant. But this? This was laughable. A minor charge. A misunderstanding. A ridiculous waste of her time. Then she saw him. Judge Marcus Cole. Tall, imposing, and undeniably powerful in his black robe. His dark skin contrasted sharply against the polished wooden bench. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried the weight of experience. Valerie let out a soft chuckle. "Seriously?" she muttered under her breath. The judge didn't react. The room settled, tension hanging in the air. The prosecutor cleared her throat and began listing the charges: public intoxication, disorderly conduct, destruction of property. A luxury hotel lobby trashed. A security guard humiliated. Damage worth thousands. Valerie sighed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, come on. It was just a party." The prosecutor barely blinked. "Miss Hunt, witnesses claim you insulted staff, smashed glasses, and even," she glanced at her notes, "spat on an officer." A few gasps rippled through the courtroom. Valerie smirked, turning toward the judge. "Your Honor, do we really need to do this?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "I mean, let's be honest. People like me don't really get convicted, right?" A hush fell over the room. Judge Cole remained still, his fingers steepled. "People like you?" he repeated. Valerie shrugged. "You know what I mean. We all do." The judge's gaze didn't waver. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Even Valerie's lawyer seemed to tense beside her. The judge finally leaned forward. "Miss Hunt, let me make one thing clear. This is my courtroom, and you will address it with the respect it deserves." Valerie rolled her eyes again, an exaggerated motion. "Oh, please. I know how this goes. A fine, some community service, maybe a little speech about responsibility, and then I go home." She grinned, resting her chin on her hand. "So, let's just wrap this up, shall we?" Judge Cole remained silent for a long moment. Then he picked up a file, flipping through the pages slowly, deliberately. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Hunt, you assume you know how this will end." Valerie crossed her arms. "Obviously." The judge's lips curled into something that almost resembled a smile. But there was no warmth in it. Just something cold. Calculated. "Well," he said, closing the file, "perhaps it's time someone taught you what real consequences feel like." Valerie's smirk faltered. The air in the courtroom grew thick with unease. Even the most seasoned lawyers in the room exchanged uncertain glances. "What?" Valerie asked, her voice quieter now. Judge Cole adjusted his robe. "I was prepared to issue a standard ruling. But given your attitude and lack of remorse, I believe a different course of action is necessary." Valerie sat up straighter. "Wait, what does that mean?" The judge glanced at the bailiff. "Miss Hunt, you wanted to wrap this up quickly." His tone was calm, measured. "So let's not waste time. Effective immediately, you are sentenced to." He paused. The whole room held its breath. Then he delivered the verdict. Valerie's face drained of color. Her mouth fell open. The courtroom erupted. Valerie's smirk vanished the moment Judge Marcus Cole spoke. "I hereby sentence you to 90 days in county jail." Silence gripped the room like an iron fist. The words hung in the air, heavy and immovable. Valerie blinked. She let out a small laugh, as if waiting for the punchline. "Excuse me," she said, shifting in her seat. "You're joking, right?" Judge Cole didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, firm. "I assure you, Miss Hunt, this is no joke." A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor, who had been pushing for a harsh penalty, looked taken aback. Valerie's lawyer, a middle-aged man in a sleek gray suit, leaped to his feet. "Your Honor, 90 days is excessive for a first-time offender." "My client." "Your client," Judge Cole interrupted, "has demonstrated a complete lack of remorse. She has shown no understanding of the consequences of her actions. This court is not in the business of handing out meaningless slaps on the wrist." Valerie shook her head, gripping the edges of the defense table. "This isn't happening," she muttered. "This doesn't happen to people like me." The judge rested his hands on the bench. "You made that abundantly clear, Miss Hunt. Perhaps that's the problem." Her lawyer tried again. "Your Honor, I respectfully request an alternative sentence: probation, rehabilitation, community service." "Denied." A murmur spread across the room. The sound of pens scratching against notepads filled the air as reporters jotted down every word. This was more than just a high-profile case now, it was a story. Valerie's nails dug into the table. "I can't go to jail. This is insane." Judge Cole's expression didn't change. "You should have considered that before you decided to mock this court." Her breathing became rapid. She turned to her father, sitting behind her in the gallery. William Hunt, a powerful businessman with connections in all the right places, was already pulling out his phone. But even he looked rattled. Valerie's heart pounded. This wasn't supposed to happen. "I'll appeal," she snapped, gripping the edge of the table. "I'll have this overturned before the day is over." Judge Cole leaned back slightly, eyes cold. "You are, of course, entitled to an appeal. But until then, you will be taken into custody immediately." The words hit her like a slap. Immediately. The bailiff stepped forward. "No," Valerie whispered, stepping back. "No, you can't do this." But the officer was already beside her, motioning for her to turn around. Her breaths came fast and shallow. The room swayed. Handcuffs clicked around her wrists. A fresh wave of gasps filled the courtroom. The weight of the metal pressed into her skin, cold and unrelenting. This was really happening. She looked toward her father again, expecting him to stand up, to demand the judge change his decision, to use his influence to stop this nightmare. But he was frozen in place, his expression unreadable. The officer gently pulled her forward. She stumbled, her designer heels suddenly feeling foreign on her feet. Valerie turned to Judge Cole one last time. Her voice shook. "You can't do this to me." The judge's eyes locked onto hers. "Miss Hunt, I'm not doing anything to you. You did this to yourself." Then, before she could process what was happening, she was being led out of the courtroom. She heard reporters whispering. She heard cameras clicking. But the only sound that truly registered was the slamming of the heavy courtroom doors behind her. The holding cell. The cold, fluorescent lights in the holding area buzzed overhead. The walls were gray, the floors scuffed and dull. Valerie sat on a metal bench, hands still cuffed, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had never felt so powerless. A guard stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her. This was temporary, she told herself. This wasn't real. Her father would fix this. He always did. Valerie turned to the female officer standing near the door. "How long do I have to stay here?" The officer barely looked at her. "You'll be processed and transferred within the hour." "Transferred where?" "County jail." Valerie's stomach turned. This wasn't happening. She straightened, summoning the confidence she had worn like armor her entire life. I'll pay whatever fine I need to. I'll do community service. Whatever the judge wants. Just, not jail. The officer's expression didn't change. You had your chance in that courtroom. Valerie's hands curled into fists. She wasn't used to people saying no to her. This had to be a mistake. A sudden thought struck her. Maybe this was a scare tactic. Maybe the judge wanted to teach her a lesson before letting her go. That had to be it. She was Valerie Hunt. She didn't belong here. An unexpected visitor. Half an hour passed. Then an officer opened the cell door. Your lawyer is here. Valerie exhaled sharply. Finally. She stood quickly, smoothing down her designer blouse as she stepped out of the holding area. But when she saw who was waiting, her stomach dropped. It wasn't her lawyer. It was Judge Marcus Cole. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his sharp eyes scanning her face. Valerie's throat tightened. What are you doing here? The officer beside him spoke. The judge requested a private moment before your transfer. Valerie's heart pounded. Was this it? Was he going to change his mind? As the officer left, she let out a shaky breath. Are you here to let me go? Judge Cole remained silent for a moment, then spoke. No, Miss Hunt. I'm here to explain why you're not walking away from this. Valerie swallowed. He continued. You think this is unfair. But tell me, how fair was it when you mocked the security guard at that hotel? When you spit on a police officer? When you laughed at this court, assuming your wealth would protect you? She clenched her jaw. I didn't think. No, the judge said, cutting her off. You didn't. For the first time, something deep and unsettling coiled in Valerie's stomach. Judge Cole took a slow step closer. You think this is about me making an example of you? It's not. It's about accountability. And for the first time in your life, Miss Hunt, you are about to experience it. Her mouth went dry. I hope, he added, voice low, that you use this time to reflect on who you are. And who you want to be when you walk out of those gates. Then he turned, walking toward the door. Panic surged in Valerie's chest. She took a step forward, her voice cracking. Wait. But he was already gone. And an officer was waiting to take her to jail, the metal doors slammed shut behind her. Valerie flinched at the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air inside the county jail was thick, heavy with the scent of sweat, old metal, and something else, something rotten, something she couldn't quite place. She had seen places like this in movies, but never in real life. Never like this. The female officer beside her barely spared her a glance. Strip search first. Then you get your uniform. Valerie's stomach dropped. Excuse me? You heard me, the officer said, her tone bored. Standard procedure. Valerie's face burned. That's insane. You can't. The officer sighed. You can fight it, but that'll only delay your processing. Your choice. Valerie wanted to argue, to scream, but the exhaustion was setting in. The stress, the fear, the sheer disbelief that this was really happening, it was all becoming too much. Her mouth went dry as she stepped into the processing room. Minutes later, humiliation flooded her as she changed into the stiff, faded orange jumpsuit. It smelled of industrial detergent, but not enough to cover the stench of previous wearers. She pulled it over her body, her expensive perfume now just a memory. Her designer clothes, her jewelry, her perfectly styled hair, none of it mattered anymore. She was an inmate now. First night behind bars. The cell was small, barely big enough for the thin mattress shoved against the wall and the rusted metal toilet in the corner. The walls were gray, cracked in places, covered in faint graffiti. The door clanked shut. Valerie stood frozen. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be real. She turned toward the small window covered in thick metal bars. Outside, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows along the floor. Then she heard it, laughter. Rough, mocking laughter from somewhere down the hall. Goosebumps crawled up her arms. She sank onto the thin mattress, hugging her arms around herself. The fabric of the jumpsuit felt scratchy against her skin. Her father would fix this. Any minute now, her lawyer would call. But the minutes stretched into hours. Nothing. She clenched her jaw, willing herself not to cry. She wouldn't break. She couldn't break. The harsh reality. The morning came too soon. A loud buzzer jolted her awake. Her neck ached from the stiff mattress, and for a split second, she forgot where she was. Then the cold reality hit her. She wasn't home. She wasn't in her luxurious apartment with Egyptian cotton sheets and a personal chef making her breakfast. She was in jail. And breakfast here wasn't avocado toast and fresh squeezed juice. It was a lump of watery oatmeal and a dry, crumbling biscuit. Valerie barely touched it. Her stomach was in knots. But the real nightmare began when she was led into the common area. Women of all shapes and sizes sat at tables, talking in low voices or staring at nothing. Some looked tired. Some looked dangerous. Valerie swallowed hard. She didn't belong here. A woman with tattoos covering her arms leaned back in her seat, eyeing Valerie like a hungry wolf. "Fresh meat," she murmured. Another woman snorted. "Ain't she the rich girl? The one who thought she was better than everybody?" Laughter. Low and mean. Valerie's hands curled into fists. She kept her chin high. She wouldn't let them see fear. But inside, she was shaking. First lesson, respect is earned. The first real test came later that afternoon. Valerie was standing near the wall, trying to stay invisible, when she felt someone shove her shoulder. She turned sharply. A tall woman with cropped hair and sharp brown eyes stood in front of her, arms crossed. "You think you're better than us?" Valerie's heart pounded. "I don't know what you're talking about." The woman smirked. "Yeah, you do." Around them, other inmates paused their conversations, watching. Valerie knew enough about power to recognize what was happening. This woman, whoever she was making an example out of her. And Valerie Hunt had never been on this side of power before. She took a slow breath. "I don't want any trouble." The woman chuckled. "Trouble's already here, princess." Another shove. Harder this time. Valerie's back hit the wall. Her pulse roared in her ears. She had never been in a real fight before. Never had to defend herself. Her father had paid people to handle her problems. But her father wasn't here. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone. The woman took a step closer. Then, a voice cut through the tension. "Back off, Rosa." The crowd shifted. A woman stepped forward. She was older, her face lined with experience, her eyes cold but calculating. Rosa scoffed but took a step back. The woman turned to Valerie. "Rich girl or not, you got two choices in here. Stand up for yourself, or get eaten alive." Valerie swallowed. She had no idea which one she was capable of. An unlikely mentor. Her name was Maria. She had been in and out of jail more times than she could count. For reasons Valerie couldn't understand, Maria took an interest in her. "You don't know how to survive in a place like this," Maria said, sitting across from her at lunch. You don't know how to live without power. Valerie stiffened. I'm not weak. Maria smirked. Didn't say you were. But you're blind. Valerie narrowed her eyes. What's that supposed to mean? Maria leaned forward. You think you're different from the rest of us. That this is just a mistake, a temporary inconvenience. But let me tell you something, rich girl, power don't come from money in here. Valerie stared at her. Maria continued, respect is earned, not bought. And right now? You got nothing. The word stung. But deep down, Valerie knew she was right. For the first time in her life, she wasn't special. She was just another inmate. And if she wanted to survive, she needed to learn the rules. The turning point. By the end of the first week, Valerie was exhausted. Her lawyer had visited, but there was no good news. The appeal process would take time. She was stuck. And slowly, painfully, she was starting to realize something. Judge Cole hadn't just sentenced her to jail. He had stripped her of the one thing she had always relied on, privilege. Here, in this place, she wasn't a rich girl. She wasn't special. She was just Valerie. And if she wanted to make it through this, outside, people used to listen when she spoke. They laughed at her jokes, nodded in agreement with her opinions, even when she said stupid things. Because she was Valerie Hunt, daughter of billionaire Thomas Hunt. But in here? She was nobody. And nobody cared. A new enemy. By now, she understood that Maria had given her protection, for now. But Maria wasn't the queen of this place. There were others. And some of them wanted Valerie gone. She learned this the hard way one afternoon in the showers. She had just turned off the water when she heard the sound of the door locking behind her. Her stomach clenched. Slowly, she turned around. Rosa. And 3 other women. Valerie took a step back. The wet tiles felt cold under her feet. Look at you, Rosa sneered, crossing her arms. Still walking around like you're better than the rest of us. I never said that, Valerie said carefully. Rosa chuckled. You don't have to say it. You are it. The others laughed. Valerie's heart pounded. She had seen enough prison movies to know where this was going. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. And there was no director to yell cut. Fight or flight. I don't want any trouble, Valerie said, trying to keep her voice steady. Trouble already found you, rich girl, Rosa said. Then she lunged. Instinct took over. Valerie tried to dodge, but Rosa was fast. She grabbed Valerie by the hair and yanked her forward. Pain exploded in Valerie's scalp. She gasped, stumbling, her bare feet sliding against the wet floor. Someone else shoved her from behind, and she crashed to her knees. Laughter. It rang in her ears. But then. A sharp voice cut through the air. Back off. The laughter stopped. Rosa's grip loosened. Valerie barely had time to catch her breath before she saw who had spoken. Maria. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes cold. I said back off, Maria repeated. Rosa hesitated, then clicked her tongue in annoyance. Whatever, she muttered, stepping back. She won't last long anyway. Then she and the others walked out, the door swung open. Valerie collapsed against the wall, her body shaking. Maria crouched beside her. You all right? Valerie swallowed hard. She didn't answer. She didn't trust her voice. The cost of survival. Maria waited until Valerie caught her breath. Then she spoke. That was your first warning, she said. Next time, you might not be so lucky. Valerie looked up at her. Why did you help me? Maria smirked. Because I don't like Rosa. And because you owe me now. Valerie's stomach twisted. She hated owing people. Maria stood up. You better learn fast, rich girl. This place will eat you alive if you let it. Then she walked away. Valerie sat there for a long time. She wasn't naive. She knew Maria hadn't saved her out of kindness. There was always a price. And sooner or later, she would have to pay it. The first lesson. Later that night, Valerie sat across from Maria at the metal table in the common area. Maria took a bite of her dry cornbread, then looked at Valerie. You ever been in a fight before? Valerie hesitated. No. Maria smirked. Figured. Valerie bristled. I don't see why it matters. I'll be out of here soon. Maria leaned back, amused. That so? My lawyer is working on my appeal. Maria snorted. You still think that rich daddy of yours is gonna swoop in and fix this? Valerie's mouth snapped shut. Maria's eyes softened slightly. You need to stop waiting for someone to save you. Because nobody will. Valerie swallowed. She didn't want to believe that. But deep down, a small part of her already knew it was true. Training begins. The next morning, Maria found her in the yard. Come with me, she said. Valerie frowned. Why? Maria rolled her eyes. Because if you don't learn how to defend yourself, next time Rosa won't need 3 girls to take you down. Valerie hesitated. Then she followed. Maria led her to a quiet corner of the yard, away from the guard's direct sight. First rule of fighting, Maria said, cracking her knuckles. It's not about strength. It's about strategy. Valerie crossed her arms. You sound like a bad action movie. Maria smirked. And you sound like someone who's gonna get her teeth knocked out if she doesn't listen. Valerie shut up. Maria took a stance. When someone comes at you, you don't run backward. You step into them. That makes no sense. It does when you're small. Use their momentum against them. Maria demonstrated, shifting her weight and spinning to the side. Valerie watched, then mimicked the movement. Maria nodded. Not bad. They kept going. Maria showed her how to throw an elbow, how to brace for impact, how to move her feet. Valerie wasn't great at it. But she wasn't awful either. And for the first time in weeks, she felt something strange. Control. The test. It happened 3 days later. Rosa came back. This time, she was alone. Valerie was sitting at a table, trying to keep to herself, when Rosa dropped a tray of food in front of her. Valerie looked up. Rosa grinned. Eat it. Valerie glanced down at the food. Something about it looked off. Her stomach churned. No thanks, she said. Rosa's grin widened. I wasn't asking. Valerie's pulse quickened. She glanced at Maria, who was watching from across the room. Then she took a slow breath. Stand up for yourself, or get eaten alive. Valerie met Rosa's gaze. Eat it yourself. Silence. Then. Rosa grabbed her by the collar. Valerie's training kicked in. She twisted her body, stepping into Rosa's grip instead of away. Then she shoved hard. Rosa lost balance, stumbling backward. A few inmates gasped. Maria smirked. Rosa stared at Valerie for a long moment. Then she laughed. She shook her head, muttered something under her breath, and walked away. Valerie exhaled. Maria walked up beside her. Not bad, rich girl. Valerie's hands were still shaking. But for the first time since she arrived. She wasn't just surviving. She was learning how to fight. The cafeteria buzzed with low chatter, the clinking of trays, and the occasional outburst of laughter from one of the tables. Valerie had been here long enough to recognize the unspoken rules of the room. Some tables belonged to the gang leaders, others to groups of women who had banded together for protection. And then there were the loners, the ones who kept to themselves, hoping to avoid trouble. Valerie had started as a loner. But after her standoff with Rosa, she wasn't invisible anymore. She could feel their eyes on her. Some were curious. Others were amused. And a few were dangerous. Maria sat across from her, tearing into her cornbread. "You did good, rich girl." Valerie scoffed. "I got lucky." Maria shook her head. "No, you learned. There's a difference." She leaned in slightly. "But don't get comfortable. Rosa let you go because she didn't expect that fight. Next time, she'll be ready." Valerie's stomach tightened. "So what do I do?" Maria smirked. "You keep training. And you stop thinking like a victim." The first offer. That afternoon, as Valerie sat in the yard, a woman approached her. She was tall, lean, and had a jagged scar running down her left cheek. "Valerie Hunt," the woman said, her voice smooth but firm. Valerie looked up. "Who's asking?" The woman smirked. "Name's Carla. I run things in here." Valerie glanced at Maria, who was watching from a distance. "I thought Maria ran things." Carla chuckled. "Maria runs her little corner. But real power? That's me." She crouched slightly, bringing her face level with Valerie's. "I like what you did to Rosa. Took guts." Valerie didn't answer. She wasn't sure where this was going. Carla continued. "I could use a girl like you. Join my crew, and you won't have to worry about Rosa or anyone else." Valerie hesitated. "What's the catch?" Carla's smirk widened. "Smart girl. Nothing in here is free. You work for me, you do what I say. Could be small things, messages, favors. Could be bigger things later. But in return, you're protected." Valerie glanced at Maria again. Carla followed her gaze and let out a low chuckle. "She can't protect you forever, you know. Maria's strong, but she's not untouchable. Think about it." Then she walked away. Valerie exhaled. Maria walked over, shaking her head. "Stay away from Carla." Valerie frowned. She offered protection. Maria scoffed. She offered ownership. Once you're in, there's no getting out. Valerie looked down, her thoughts racing. She had made progress, but was it enough? Could she really stand on her own without picking a side? Testing loyalty. That night, as Valerie lay on her cot, she heard whispers in the cell next to hers. "She's getting bold. She won't last. She's got Maria's favor for now, but that won't save her forever." Valerie clenched her fists. They were talking about her. She had been in here for weeks, but it was only now that she realized how fragile survival was. Maria had warned her not to get comfortable. But she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending to be tough. The next morning, she woke up to find a note slipped under her mattress. Yard. After lunch. She recognized Rosa's handwriting. Valerie's stomach twisted. This wasn't over. The second fight. Valerie stood in the yard, the sun beating down on her. She had spent the last few days training with Maria, but nothing prepared her for the feeling of knowing a fight was coming. Rosa approached, cracking her knuckles. "You got lucky last time, rich girl." Valerie took a deep breath. "I'm not looking for trouble." Rosa grinned. "But trouble found you." Then she lunged. Valerie sidestepped, just like Maria taught her. She felt Rosa's fist graze past her ribs, but she didn't panic. Instead, she grabbed Rosa's arm and twisted, using her opponent's own momentum against her. Rosa grunted, stumbling. Valerie didn't wait. She threw an elbow, hitting Rosa in the shoulder. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to make Rosa step back. The crowd around them murmured. Rosa wiped her mouth, glaring. Not bad. Valerie braced for another attack. But instead, Rosa chuckled. Then she nodded. All right. You're not as weak as I thought. Then she walked away. Valerie's knees almost buckled from the adrenaline. She turned to Maria, who was smirking. Now that was a fight. A hard choice. That night, Valerie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Carla had offered her a deal. Maria had warned her against it. Rosa had tested her strength, but it still wasn't enough to guarantee her safety. She had a choice to make. She could keep walking the tightrope, hoping not to fall. Or she could pick a side. But no matter what, one thing was clear. The old Valerie, the one who had stepped into this prison thinking she would be saved, was gone. And whoever she was becoming, she had to be strong enough to survive. Valerie sat on the edge of her cot, staring at the cement floor. Her hands were still bruised from her last fight with Rosa. The soreness in her muscles reminded her that survival in here wasn't just about keeping her head down, it was about proving she could stand on her own. But could she? Carla's offer played in her mind. Protection. Power. Safety. It sounded good, but Maria's warning stayed with her. Once you're in, there's no getting out. She wasn't sure if she wanted to belong to anyone. The pressure builds. The next morning, Valerie stepped into the yard, keeping her shoulders straight and her face unreadable. She had learned that showing weakness was an invitation for someone to take advantage of her. She didn't even make it halfway across the yard before Carla's crew spotted her. One of them, a tall, wiry woman with cold eyes, blocked her path. Boss wants to talk. Valerie glanced at Maria, who was watching from a distance. She nodded once. Fine. They led her to a shaded corner where Carla sat on a bench, arms stretched across the backrest like a queen surveying her kingdom. You've been thinking, Carla said, her lips curling into a knowing smirk. Valerie didn't answer. Carla leaned forward. Look, rich girl. I don't beg. I don't have to. You're valuable, and I'm giving you a chance to belong somewhere. But don't take too long to decide. Valerie crossed her arms. And if I say no? Carla's smirk didn't falter, but there was a sharpness in her eyes now. Then you better be ready for whatever comes next. A chill ran down Valerie's spine. Carla didn't need to say it outright, there would be consequences. She was running out of time. The warning. That evening, Maria found Valerie sitting by herself. She didn't say anything at first, just tossed a small piece of bread onto Valerie's tray. You're gonna need to eat more if you plan to keep fighting. Valerie picked at the bread but didn't respond. Maria sighed. I saw Carla's girls talking to you. Valerie exhaled. She wants an answer. And? I don't know. Maria shook her head. Bad choice either way. Valerie frowned. What do you mean? Maria leaned in. If you join her, you're locked in. You'll be doing her dirty work. And if you don't? She gave Valerie a pointed look. Then you're a loose end. Valerie's stomach twisted. So what do I do? Maria studied her. You survive. Valerie scoffed. That's not an answer. Maria sighed. You still don't get it, do you? There's no right move in here. Just the one that keeps you breathing. Valerie clenched her fists. She was sick of feeling like a pawn in someone else's game. For once, she wanted to be the one in control. The test. The next day, Valerie walked into the laundry room, expecting to finish her shift like usual. She didn't expect to find Carla waiting for her. "Decision time," Carla said, her tone almost playful. "You in or out?" Valerie swallowed hard. "I'm not looking for trouble." Carla chuckled. "Oh, sweetheart. Trouble already found you." The door behind Valerie clicked shut. She turned just in time to see one of Carla's crew lock it. Her pulse quickened. Carla stood, stepping closer. "I like you, Hunt. You've got fire. But I can't let you walk away without knowing where you stand." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small shiv, a crude blade made from a sharpened piece of metal. She held it out to Valerie. "You want in? Prove it." Valerie's breath caught. "What?" Carla nodded toward a woman on the far side of the room. A new inmate. Small, nervous, completely unaware of what was happening behind her. "Give her a little cut. Nothing serious. Just enough to send a message." Valerie's stomach churned. "You want me to hurt her?" Carla's smirk faded. "I want you to show me that you can follow orders." Valerie looked at the shiv, then at the woman. She felt the weight of every choice pressing down on her. She had two options. Take the blade and cross a line she could never uncross. Or refuse, and face the consequences. She glanced at Carla's crew. They were watching closely, waiting to see what she would do. Her hands trembled. Then she made her choice. A line drawn. Valerie met Carla's gaze and slowly, deliberately, dropped the blade onto the floor. "I'm not your puppet." For a moment, there was silence. Then Carla chuckled. A slow, amused laugh that sent a shiver down Valerie's spine. "Bold move," Carla murmured. "But stupid." She nodded at one of her girls. Before Valerie could react, a fist slammed into her ribs, knocking the air from her lungs. She stumbled back, gasping. Another blow landed against her jaw. Pain exploded in her head. She fell to the ground, coughing. Blood filled her mouth. Carla crouched beside her, lifting Valerie's chin with a single finger. "You made your choice," she said softly. "Now you live with it." She stood and walked away, her crew following. Valerie lay there, pain radiating through her body. She had stood her ground. But at what cost? The fallout. Maria found her an hour later, still slumped against the wall. She crouched down, inspecting the damage. "You're an idiot," she muttered. Valerie managed a weak smirk. "So I've been told." Maria sighed. "Carla won't forget this. You need to be careful." Valerie wiped blood from her lip. "I'm done being scared." Maria studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good." She helped Valerie to her feet. "Now let's make sure you live long enough to regret it." The pain in Valerie's ribs made it hard to breathe. Every step sent sharp aches through her body, but she forced herself to keep moving. She refused to let anyone see her weakness. Maria had warned her, Carla wouldn't forget this. Valerie had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. But how long could she survive? The isolation begins. The first sign of trouble came at breakfast. Valerie grabbed her tray and went to sit next to Maria, but before she could sit, a heavy hand slammed the seat down in front of her. "Taken." Valerie looked up. The woman glaring at her wasn't part of Carla's crew, just another inmate who had decided Valerie was on the wrong side of things. She turned to another table. "Seats full," someone muttered before she could even ask. Everywhere she looked, backs turned on her. Maria motioned for her to come over, but before Valerie could move, one of Carla's girls accidentally bumped into her, knocking the tray from her hands. Her breakfast spilled onto the floor. Laughter rippled through the cafeteria. Valerie clenched her jaw, swallowing her anger. She wouldn't give them the reaction they wanted. She bent down, picked up her tray, and walked away. No safe place. The isolation didn't stop there. At work duty, her name was removed from the usual shifts, leaving her stuck with the worst jobs, scrubbing toilets, hauling garbage, and working double shifts in the laundry with no breaks. At night, she lay awake, knowing Carla's people were watching. Waiting. The guards weren't much help. Some of them enjoyed seeing inmates tear each other apart. Others had been paid off by Carla long ago. Maria sat down beside her one evening, tossing a small bag of crackers onto Valerie's cot. "Eat," she said. "You look like you're dying." Valerie smirked. "That bad?" Maria's expression was serious. "They're trying to break you. Make you beg for Carla's protection." Valerie exhaled. "Not happening." Maria studied her. "Then you need a plan. A dangerous proposal." 2 days later, Valerie got an unexpected visitor. Her lawyer, Mr. Hayes. She hadn't seen him since the sentencing. Seeing his sharp suit and calm expression felt like looking at a ghost from another life. "You look terrible," he said, setting his briefcase down. Valerie shrugged. "Prison isn't exactly a spa retreat." He sighed. "Listen, I don't have much time, but I got some news. There might be a way to get your sentence reduced." Her heart skipped. "What?" Hayes lowered his voice. "There's an ongoing investigation into corruption in this facility. Bribes, contraband, certain gangs running things under the guards' noses." Valerie stiffened. "Carla." Hayes nodded. "If you can provide useful information, they might reconsider your case." She hesitated. Snitching in prison was a death sentence. Hayes leaned in. "Think about it, Valerie. You're not built for this place. You don't have to rot here. This could be your way out." Valerie stared at the table, her mind racing. Could she really do this? The price of freedom. That night, Maria found her pacing in their cell. "You're thinking about taking the deal." Valerie looked up. "If it gets me out of here." Maria sighed. "You're playing with fire. What choice do I have?" Maria sat on her cot, arms crossed. "Snitches don't last long in here." Valerie ran a hand through her hair. "I don't have a lot of options, Maria. Carla's got the guards, half the inmates, and probably the warden in her pocket. If I don't do something, I'll end up dead." Maria was silent for a moment. Then she spoke softly. "If you do this, you need a way to survive until it pays off." Valerie swallowed hard. "You have a plan?" Maria's expression was unreadable. "Something like that. The setup." The next morning, Valerie made her move. She approached Carla in the yard, ignoring the stares from other inmates. Carla smirked as Valerie stopped in front of her. "Look who finally decided to crawl back." Valerie forced herself to stay calm. "I made a mistake." Carla leaned forward. "Oh?" Valerie nodded. "I thought I could handle being on my own. I was wrong." Carla studied her. "And now?" Valerie met her gaze. "I want in." A slow smile spread across Carla's face. "Smart girl." She gestured for one of her crew to step forward. "Prove it." Valerie braced herself. "How?" Carla's smirk widened. "There's a guard who needs a reminder of who's in charge." She tossed Valerie a small object. A blade. Valerie's stomach clenched. She was being tested again. Only this time, the target wasn't an inmate. This was bigger. More dangerous. More permanent. She had to think fast. A desperate gamble. Valerie took the blade, forcing herself to nod. When? Carla chuckled. Tonight. Valerie walked away, her pulse pounding. She needed a way out. Fast. That night, Maria slipped something into her hand. A tiny, folded piece of paper. It had a name on it. A guard. One of the few that hadn't been bought by Carla. You want to survive? Maria whispered. Give this to him. Tell him everything. Valerie gripped the paper tightly. She was about to risk everything.